well-established indie name filmmakers entered the new millennium prepared to take over the cinematic establishment. In fact, despite the hype that these filmmakers often received for their first or second films, most of them had bigger commercial successes a decade or more later.
I think this just might be my masterpiece.
Today, those 90s indie directors remain fixtures in award seasons, best of the year lists, festivals, and even the US box office. Still, they're not the people making billion-dollar superhero movies. In recent years, both studios and audiences have moved away from the kinds of mid to low budget, adult-oriented, non-franchise dramas and comedies that these directors make. The struggling ratings of the Oscars are but one sign of this. Today, the director of a Sundance sensation is often faced with the choice of either signing on to make a mega-budget franchise movie, see Anna Boden and Ryan Fleck moving from Half Nelson and Mississippi Grind to Captain Marvel, or taking their more personal or risky projects to streaming or TV, see Ava DuVernay directing When They See Us as a Netflix miniseries. There isn't a clear new class of superstar indie directors coming up behind Wes Anderson, Quentin Tarantino, Sofia Coppola, or Spike Jonze because newer filmmakers aren't really encouraged to follow their muses in the same way as those 90s legacy directors. The result is just one more aspect of the widening gap between big-budget cinematic extravaganzas that receive huge theatrical releases and everything else, fighting for scraps of cultural recognition.
The Marvel-type pictures, where the theaters become amusement parks, that's a different experience, and it's not cinema, it's something else. We shouldn't be invaded by it.
At the same time, the 90s indie boom remains influential. For one thing, it vastly increased the prominence of film festivals, as film fans and critics still flock to Sundance, Toronto, and New York, as well as a plethora of smaller festivals to see new independent features. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, those festivals have started to become more accessible than ever before, offering films to stream online for the ticket-buying public. The 90s indie aesthetic also made low budget a more permanent part of a movie's potential marketing story.
We just took with what we had to work with, which is a very, kind of a minimal budget, minimal resources, and use those as our strengths.
When The Blair Witch Project debuted at Sundance 1999, so much of its buzz depended on its low-budget documentary-style look and feel, and this was a natural outgrowth of the 90s indie movie PR machines that emphasized how little some of these movies cost to make.
All this is actually the byproduct of a film that cost around $35,000 to make.
Blair Witch Project inspired countless more low-budget imitators, and not every ultra-low-budget miracle is a genre piece. Think of Once, the musical romance that cost less than $200,000 to make, or Tangerine, Sean Baker's movie about transgender sex workers, shot entirely on iPhones. Even Sex Lies and Videotape director Steven Soderbergh has recently returned to his roots, making movies outside the studio system, also sometimes shooting on iPhone.
Cinema is something that's made, and it has nothing to do with the capture medium.
Meanwhile, the big studio subsidiaries specializing in acquiring indie films like Universal's Focus Features or Fox's Searchlight division also became more interested in finding crowd-pleasing hits with awards potential, like Little Miss Sunshine.
You gotta want it better than anybody else.
I do.
Then you're gonna be a winner.
These divisions filled a void in their parent companies, but helped squeeze out genuinely independent distributors, while over time taking fewer chances with their own acquisitions. The indie gold rush seemed to be over, at least in spirit.
1993, Steven Spielberg reclaimed his throne as king of the blockbuster with Jurassic Park. The film delivered set pieces that were larger than ever before thanks to a relatively new and special effects technique, computer-generated imagery, or CGI. Spielberg dinosaurs were, and still are, exceptionally terrifying.
Jurassic Park's $912 million gross in '93 made the former measure of a summer blockbuster extinct. But a 1994 Disney movie put animation into the ring for King of the Summer for the first time. The Lion King clawed up $763 million, a record for animation, and 25 years later, a so-called photorealistic update grossed $1.6 billion for the Mouse House. Between these lions, every top summer blockbuster can be traced back to the first 19 years of establishing the recipe for box office success. So, Here goes nothing.
Welcome to Earth.
1996's high-concept hijinks of Independence Day make Will Smith a star for 97's Men in Black, produced by Spielberg, who was back in the director's chair for the 1998 summer topper, Saving Private Ryan, before he cleared the stage for his pal George Lucas and the return of Star Wars in 1999's Episode 1, The Phantom Menace.
Now this is pod racing.
1999. The end of the road for the 90s and the 20th century. The year 2000 was just around the corner, but first, the world would have to get past the dreaded Y2K. 99 would be a cliffhanger ending, with twists and turns right up to the finale, where it would be the end of the road for a famed director. A tragedy would unfold in Colorado. Get ready, this finale is going to be a doozy.
You are here for me to enlighten you.
Today, we're going to talk about the news, culture, sports, and entertainment, and all that was weird in the 90s. This is Timeline. President Bill Clinton's impeachment trial began with 2 charges. The first one being Paula Jones for harassment. Jones alleged Clinton, then the governor of Arkansas, got an Arkansas State Police trooper to have Jones meet Clinton in his hotel room, where he exposed himself to her. The second charge was perjury and obstruction of justice. A little over a month later, Clinton was acquitted, as the Senate did not achieve the necessary 2/3 vote for impeachment. After the hearing, Clinton apologized and said he was profoundly sorry for the burden he imposed on the American people.
Take your hat off.
Excuse me? It's my hat. I'll wear it where I want.
Six days after he screened the final cut of Eyes Wide Shut to Warner Brothers, Stanley Kubrick died in his sleep at the age of 70 from a heart attack on March 7th. Kubrick's family held a small private funeral for him at his home. Heading into June, the music world changed forever when Sean Fanning and Sean Parker launched Napster, allowing anyone to download songs for free. Napster came at a time when albums could cost up to $20. That's almost $32 adjusted for inflation. The party didn't last for long, though. On March 13th, 2000, Metallica drummer Lars Ulrich filed a lawsuit against Napster. And on July 11th, 2001, Napster shut down its entire network. Beginning on Thursday, July 22nd, and concluding on Sunday the 25th, Woodstock returned for the 3rd time. From day one, it was a show for poor infrastructure, lack of water, lack of shade, and shameless price gouging. On Saturday night, the 400,000-plus festival attendees finally revolted. 40 minutes into Limp Bizkit's set, Fred Durst whipped the unwashed masses into a frenzy. Thousands began chanting the lyrics to Break Stuff, and thus began their 2-day demolition of the former Griffiths Air Force Base. By the time the Chili Peppers ended their headlining set with a cover of Jimi Hendrix's Fire, a good portion of the festival grounds were literally en fuego. The United Nations Population Fund decided on October 12th as the Day of 6 Billion, the approximate day that the world's population hit the 6 billion people on Earth mark. In late November, 40,000 street protesters gathered outside the Washington State Convention and Trade Center. They were protesting issues such as workers' rights, sustainable economies, and environmental and social issues. Speaking of leaving 1999, on the last day of the 20th century, the big fear was Y2K. The Y2K theory was that once the clock struck midnight on December 31st, global computer systems wouldn't be able to process the 2 and 0 in the year 2000. This could cause software malfunctions to bring down worldwide industries and even air traffic. Companies spent billions of dollars restructuring and securing their data and rewriting code. End-of-the-world predictions and apocalyptic scenarios were commonly mentioned.
During that time of tribulation, the Antichrist will come to great power.
But in the end, nothing really happened. Wah, wah. And that is how 1999 would end.
The Sixth Sense, Notting Hill, American Beauty, Being John Malkovich, The Matrix, The Virgin Suicides, Fight Club, Eyes Wide Shut, American Pie, Rushmore, The Talented Mr. Ripley, Office Space, The Best Man, Boys Don't Cry, Magnolia, The Blair Witch Project, Girl Interrupted. Chances are you've seen half, if not most, of the films I just listed. Chances are you found yourself debating a few of them at some point in your life. And chances are at least one of them had a major impact on you in one way or another. And if I were to tell you that all of these films came out in 1999, would you believe me? It's true. 1999 was a stacked year for American filmmaking, colored by some of the most bizarre, innovative, thematically provocative, and most importantly, memorable films to date. Of course, there have been other years that are jam-packed with legendary films. 1939, 1967, and 1977 are great ones. The most recent which comes to mind for me is 2017, which gave us paradigm-shifting movies like Get Out, Call Me By Your Name, Lady Bird, Dunkirk, and Phantom Thread, all of which made it to the Oscars. But there's something about 1999 that had a particular impact, where films of all genres managed to stay on our favorites lists for decades, or became so popular that they've experienced second and third lives as overrated and then rated again. Why was 1999 such an iconic year for movies? We can't fully understand what was happening in 1999 without jumping back 10 years to the release of Steven Soderbergh's Sex, Lies, and Videotape. The rise of home video and video rentals in the 80s allowed a number of independent distributors to pop up, but by the end of the decade, many of these, like Vestron, Island, and Cinecom, ended up investing more into bigger budget productions. So people were expecting the independent market to collapse. That was until Miramax came around. I'm sure most of you know by now that Miramax was founded by convicted sex offender Harvey Weinstein and his brother Bob. But unfortunately, I can't overstate how much of an influence this company had over 90s cinema. Miramax, who had had quite a few hits in the 80s but were still relatively small, took a risk on Soderbergh's weird, sleepy, moody film, and it more than paid off. The film premiered at Sundance and its reception was explosive, so much so that it even had Soderbergh a bit worried. I'm a little concerned by what Sex Lies might have wrought here. This can become more of a film market than a film festival. And I mean, his fears would later be realized. Film festivals have definitely become a marketplace for distributors to place their bids right then and there, sometimes even before the film runs. But this also meant independent films could get their commercial breaks. With the added bonus of digital editing software, camera innovations, and a new generation of directors, writers, and film executives who had grown up on new Hollywood films of the 60s and 70s and were now coming out of film school, as well as even older established directors who were coming out with daring films of their own, we were going to see a major boom here. And it would get a name. Indie would. In Best Movie Year Ever, How 1999 Blew Up the Big Screen, Brian Raftery writes 20 years later, in 2019, about how the 90s led to exactly that, the best movie year ever. He attributes the exceptionality of 1999 to this convergence of indie film and Hollywood box office numbers, saying, "By the time Sundance 1999 rolled around, there was a well-worn playbook for turning a low-budget movie into a middlebrow success, one that Miramax had helped create. Find a slightly outsidery tale of uplift with a famous face or two, hype up its festival cred and underdog charm, roll it out delicately across the country." So we had this decade where experimental cult films were being produced en masse, and for the most part actually being seen by the public. Films that had escaped the art house theaters where they would have traditionally belonged. In a way, this was perfect timing for the late 90s imaginary. 1999 was a peculiar year for the culture. For starters, this was a year marred by Y2K hysteria, when people were freaking out about a software issue that would lead to computers processing the year 2000 as 1900, which could potentially shut them down entirely. Since society was increasingly digitized at this point, these computers were in charge of a ton of critical systems that ran everyday life: communications, electricity, transportation, finance, medicine, employment, and the government. Some predicted that this would lead to a global shutdown and ensuing Armageddon. None of this ended up happening, and many of the foreseen problems ended up being solved before midnight January 1st, 2000. My dad was actually a part of a team working with the Canadian Ministry of Health to mitigate disruptions to the system, fun fact. But this doesn't mean that the fear leading up to it didn't pervade the collective psyche at the time. As Raftery surmises, whether they were freaked out by technology or theology, many of the end-timers shared a common tut-tutting anxiety, namely that we'd advanced a bit too much during the 20th century, sacrificing our humanity in favor of ease and desire. Two major groups were both the purveyors and inheritors of the Y2K panic. Groups who were also the target audience for these types of movies I'm talking about. One was the baby boomers, who occupied a cohort of people in their 30s and 40s. people who once belonged to the hippie generation but had now evolved into active participants of the managerial and professional middle class. In their 1978 book, Between Labor and Capital, Barbara and John Ehrenreich call these newly middle-aged boomers the professional managerial class, which consists of salaried mental workers who do not own the means of production and whose function in the social division of labor may be described broadly as a reproduction of capitalist culture and capitalist class relations. In other words, office folk. These guys were considered a new middle class, and so determined new tastes, patterns of consumption, and an entirely new class consciousness. The other group were the cohort of people ranging from their late teens to mid-30s, who were expected to helm whatever future was brought about by this impending catastrophe. Generation X, a term coined by Douglas Copeland in a 1991 essay for Vancouver Magazine, which he used to define his generation's lack of definability. Generation X came into the world at a time of shifting social values, experiencing childhood during an uptick in divorce rates, and when women were entering the workforce en masse. They were called latchkey kids, children who were left all alone to fend for themselves. They had grown up with the disillusionment brought about by Watergate, economic fears of the oil crisis, and served witness to the 24-hour media frenzies of the OJ trial and the Lewinsky scandal. Also, they had seen technology become a governing and radicalizing force with the dot-com boom. For them, the boomers were sellouts, traitors to the tenets of hippiedom. But to the boomers, Gen X were useless and aimless.
Try something for once in your life, do something about it, but you know what? You better do it now, and you better do it fast, because the world doesn't owe you any favors.
Which triggered a general resentment from younger generations. As writer Jeff Gordiner laments, I don't really understand the tyranny of the boomer movement. Great, you had a party in Haight-Ashbury in 1967. I'm thrilled for you. When Edward Norton was interviewed by Raftery about Fight Club, he echoed a pretty similar sentiment, expressing an annoyance with the re-release of the Volkswagen Beetle, which was actually my family car growing up. Another fun fact. They just want to repackage an authentic baby boomer youth experience to us. They don't even want us to have our own. They just want us to buy sentiment for the 60s, and they wonder why we're cynical. A lot of these films explore feelings of nihilism, impotence, and listlessness. Many of their protagonists are chained to drab offices, a monotonous, senseless middle-class life. And they are often left with a choice. They can either stay in the fog and die, or look beyond it and choose a sort of absurd, twisted happiness. I think what makes these films so special is that they really crack at the foundations of American identity, particularly the tenuous facade of the American dream. Many of these films investigate a sense of broken masculinity that was permeating the US at the time.
That what a man looks like?
As Garen Pernia writes for Esquire, Fight Club, American Beauty, and Office Space depicted the American male eschewing societal norms and sometimes literally fisticuffing against consumerism, suburbia, and complacency. Even films like Boys Don't Cry and Virgin Suicides, both of which had women directors, posit similar ideas. Boys Don't Cry highlights the violence that erupts from challenged masculinity. The Virgin Suicides watches the Lisbon sisters through the lens of neighborhood boys who, when the film visits them years later, live in the distorted memories of their adolescence to cope with the mundanity of their middle-aged suburban lives. But I think American Beauty is the perfect encapsulation of where the culture was at this year. A provocative, mid-budget film directed by then-unknown Sam Mendes, American Beauty tells the story of a man, Lester Burnham, feeling stifled by his routine middle-class life and fantasizing about his daughter's underage friend. And yes, he is quite unfortunately played by Kevin Spacey. He also has a sour Gen X daughter who hates her boomer parents and becomes infatuated with her disaffected and alienated neighbor. The film begins with Lester telling us that in a year, he will be dead, and it suggests that his daughter and her lover may have been the ones to do it. American Beauty swept at the Oscars, raking in 5 awards, including Best Picture. It also absolutely exploded at the box office, and received universal praise upon its release. It tapped into a feeling that had been building throughout 1999, that something about the country was slightly off. In a year that saw a pair of suburban Colorado teenage killers dubbed the Monsters Next Door on the cover of Time, and a president who almost lost his job over a May-December sex scandal, the seamy underbelly of American Beauty felt creepily relatable. This was also the year that Columbine happened. For me, the film also gets to the heart of the boomer Gen X culture war, and the effects of an increasingly mediatized society. Like Neo with the Red Pill, the narrator with Project Mayhem, and Craig with the Malkovich portal, Lester must decide whether to accept the conditions of his senseless life or reject them. In many instances, these protagonists choose to reject or destroy them, but Lester chooses acceptance. And it seems that this concept of nihilistic despair was incredibly evocative for 1999 audiences. After all, the world was about to end, right? Target audiences, the baby boomers and Generation X, were impotent and about to enter the great nothing. And right at the end of eternity, wasn't it better to just accept it?
Can you explain what internet is?
That little mark with the A and then the ring around it?
At?
See, that's what I said. Kay said she thought it was about.
Yeah. Oh.
The information superhighway can be a confusing mix of on-ramps and off-ramps.
The internet starts as a military communication network in the 60s and spends the next 20 years being further developed in university computer science labs. But it was the creation of the World Wide Web in 1990, a series of web pages connected by hyperlinks, that made the internet become something that the average person can use.
Your link to literature, the arts, the world at your fingertips.
The free transfer of information in as accessible a way as possible. We're going to make it so that anybody can access anything from anywhere. I was like, well, that's kind of a cool idea.
And who better to latch onto a cool new idea than baby boomers Bill Clinton and Al Gore? When they get elected in 1993, the World Wide Web is at the center of their proposed tech-based economy.
Eisenhower had built the interstate highway system. Well, Clinton and Gore were going to bring in the age of the information superhighway.
Clinton makes good on his promise, but he gets some much-needed help from a company that builds an on-ramp to this new digital future. The company is founded in 1994 by Mark Andreessen, a 23-year-old computer science grad from the University of Illinois, and Jim Clark, an established Silicon Valley entrepreneur.
Jim Clark became convinced in talking to Mark that the internet space was wide open for the taking. Yeah, this thing that was right now being used for scientific purposes could potentially be used for commercial purposes. He could envision that we might want to sell things. He could envision that it could be used for, widespread communication.
In the early 90s, the web is slow and hard to navigate. It's the domain of academics and computer geeks. But Clark and Andreessen have a vision to make the web accessible to everyone.
We ended up sort of in the middle of the night starting this project. What we were trying to do was put sort of a human face on the internet.
True to its namesake, the browser is a navigator to the web, making surfing as easy as point and click.
Netscape Navigator was the first commercial version of a web browser that spawned Apple Safari, it spawned Google Chrome. All of a sudden, the power of the internet that had been there for years was available to everybody in an easy way, point and click, the universal language.
By the time digital video discs, or DVDs, arrived in 1995, consumers were primed for a technological revolution. See, in 1987, Paramount Pictures tried an experiment. They offered the VHS cassette of Top Gun for just $30 instead of $80 or $90, and it was a runaway hit. Who knew people like to pay less for things? Almost immediately, other studios followed Paramount's lead, and by the early 1990s, people could afford to build their very own home video libraries. One issue with VHS tapes is that they degrade over time. The more you watch them, the more the actual tape wears down, eventually rendering them unviewable. Like me. In part, that's because VHS is an analog technology, while DVD is digital. Both analog and digital technologies transmit information, usually through electric signals. One of the main differences is that analog technologies translate information into electric pulses of varying amplitudes, while digital technologies translate information into a binary format made of ones and zeros, which represent discrete amplitudes. DVDs, like most digital technologies, don't degrade like VHS tapes. The ones are always ones and the zeros are always zeros. So the signal will always look the same, unless you're at your parents' house where it will always look green and squished. Come on, Mom and Dad, fix your TV settings. The durability of DVDs, mixed with an impressive increase in storage capacity, made them an extremely attractive upgrade from video cassettes. With all that extra storage space, home video releases could come with all kinds of fun extras, like trailers for other movies, alternate cuts and deleted scenes, isolated scores, commentary tracks where the filmmaker could talk about making the film, and closed captioning that could be turned on or off. Along with new releases, distribution companies could repackage their old libraries with DVD special features and make even more money.
A couple years ago, the design and architecture podcast 99% Invisible released an episode about the invention of the movie megaplex. You know, those semi-monstrosities you drive by on the way to your local suburban box mall. The podcast marks 1995 as a game-changing year for the world of movie exhibition. The year that the first megaplex, the AMC Grand 24 in Dallas, was built. Essentially, movie theaters had their heyday all the way back in the 40s, before television, home video, DVD, and streaming services came to ruin things for everyone. By the time the 50s rolled around and television got its start, theaters were forced to make movie-going a whole event, screening only the most spectacular, big-budget films they could get their hands on. This was also a time where a film only lived at a single given location, typically in urban areas, so you had to trek there pilgrimage style if you wanted to see it. But as the suburbs expanded, studios realized there was enough demand to build theaters out there, resulting in the construction of some pretty strange cinemas in the early 70s. These ones cut up their screens to allow for more films to be shown simultaneously, resulting in super long and narrow, cramped cinemas. A lot of these were built in malls around this time too. Now, initially, the movie-going experience was a bit of a luxury one where you and the kids would get all dolled up for a sophisticated night on the town. But these mall cinemas were pretty gross and not properly cared for, leading to a drop in ticket sales in the mid-80s when people were opting to watch films from the comfort of their own homes. Again, we were seeing the 50s trend of fewer, spectacular movies take hold, as theaters tried to accommodate for declining numbers. This is right around when Stan Durwood created the American Multi-Cinema, or AMC, a new style of cinema with neon lights, clean seats, arcade games, stadium seating, and most importantly, many, many more screens. This changed everything. Now, with the proliferation of screens to show movies on, studios had to start producing more movies, giving them more room to experiment with a greater variety of films. Now, more original, smaller-scale films were getting their own real estate. As they say on 99% Invisible, the megaplex was a Trojan horse for slipping strange movies into unsuspecting suburbs. If the latest teen movie is sold out, kids might end up seeing something like John Malkovich. And yeah, being John Malkovich is really, really weird.
Malkovich.
But it's also one of the most revered films of 1999 and opened in 630 theaters. More eyes on these offbeat movies meant more people were seeing stuff that reflected their daily realities, that encouraged them to ponder the human condition, rather than the escapist fluff that had typically dominated the screen. The proliferation of the megaplex made it so that no one wanted to go back to the dingy old theaters, which led to a burst in the theater bubble. Theaters began closing down, and with fewer screens meant, again, fewer movies. Attention was placed back onto the opening weekend, and blockbusters started dominating the screen again. This is something, as you know, we're still grappling with today.
1999 was a year at the Oscars. Host Whoopi Goldberg entered like this, Roberto Benigni did this, half of the jokes were about this, and people weren't sure how to react about this. But despite all of that, the Oscar coverage was about this. As Vincent Canby of the New York Times put it, Saving Private Ryan was lyrically humiliated when Shakespeare in Love took home Best Picture. Since its release in the summer of 1998, Saving Private Ryan had been the odds-on favorite, so when it lost Best Picture and several other major awards, the press and industry stepped back and asked themselves why. For most people, the answer was this guy. Harvey Weinstein may be the most taboo figure in Hollywood right now, but for a long time, it was impossible to imagine the Academy Awards without him. He didn't invent campaigning for awards. It's been going on since the Oscar was a glimmer in Louis B. Mayer's eye. But his campaigns for The English Patient, Chicago, The Artist, and more earned him the reputation of having invented the modern Oscar campaign. His success was so pervasive that most of Hollywood seemed willing to overlook his abusive behavior just to get in on it. Wins bring money and prestige, so this guy had a whole lot of both, meaning a whole lot of power, and never was that more on display than in 1999 in what is considered his seminal masterpiece of Oscar campaigning. Saving Private Ryan versus Shakespeare in Love made for good press. The films had drastically different tones and represented the best of the weird amount of Elizabethan and World War II films that came out in 1998. They also represented interesting industry dynamics for the press to unpack. Articles pitted indie culture against studio blockbuster culture, and more specifically, positioned the race as a personal competition between Harvey and DreamWorks' Jeffrey Katzenberg, who, as former chairman of Walt Disney Studios, had helped orchestrate Disney's acquisition of Miramax. So generally speaking, the behind-the-scenes drama provided a more compelling narrative for the press than the actual merits of the films. Miramax's campaigning played a huge part in this, because not only did Harvey run his usual game, but he also upped the ante.
Is it different this year for any reason?
It's scrappier this year, haven't you noticed?
Scrappier.
There's quite a bit of wrangling going on.
Now, what's going on?
Well, the campaigning is a little more stressful, I think, on all sides than it usually is.
CGI was and continues to be a game changer in the film industry. Today, filmmakers can put almost anything they imagine onto the big screen. We see entire buildings, cities, worlds, and even galaxies created using CGI. Love it or hate it, I welcome it with open arms. CGI has opened the doors to so many cool things that I'm sure many people who grew up before the 90s couldn't have even imagined. CGI really started to take shape in the 90s and took a big step towards what it has become today. Sure, computer-generated imagery can be dated back to the 70s, but it wasn't until the 90s when we started to see glimpses of what was possible. I'm talking about films like Jurassic Park, where we saw the true power of CGI bring dinosaurs to life with incredible scale for the first time ever. And throughout the 90s, unlike today, CGI was still used very sparingly, but it laid the foundation for continued development and improvements. The 90s were that tipping point of when we saw CGI really show us what it can do, but still before it was widely adopted. Some other notable movies that used CGI in the 90s were The Matrix and The Titanic.
Rockets explode!
Pixar. Enough said. Okay, I'm just kidding. But in all seriousness, when you think of Pixar movies, what decade do you think of? For me, it's the 90s. And even though they only released 3 movies during that decade, man oh man, it had such a huge impact on the film industry. In 1995, Pixar released the first ever full-length 3D animated film, Toy Story. Since then, 3D animated films have become a staple in our ever-growing catalog of films coming out each year. Heck, even a lot of TV shows are now fully 3D animated. Before the 90s, every movie out there was either live action or hand-drawn. Computers weren't popular enough or powerful enough to even consider making an entire film with them. But in the years leading up to Toy Story's release, Pixar was able to make that film with only 27 animators.
Bullet time is a stylistic way of showing that you're in a constructed reality, and that time and space are not the same as, here, us today living our lives. It's slowing down time to such an extent that you really see everything around you as clearly as you possibly could. Bullet time is something that was conceived for The Matrix specifically, but I think it's the byproduct of the directors observing the controls coming into place, and then they ask the right question at the right time. Everything begins with a simulation. All the computer simulation information is the basis of a timing sequence. Each camera has a specific moment in time to fire a frame of film. All that is taking into account the net effect, the total effect of the move. That is a camera coming up to speed, moving at a speed, and coming off a speed. Particular rig, there are 120 cameras and 2 motion picture cameras set up. The rig that we've made can be configured into any shape that you want. The shapes are basically what we compose in our simulations.
Bleach bypass, or silver retention, is the process of reducing or skipping the normal bleaching of a film negative when developing color film and retaining its natural silver elements, known as halides. Bleach bypass takes its name from a technique that was used to develop a color film stock. By skipping the bleaching step in the development process, the silver halides in the film emulsion were retained, resulting in a black and white image laid over the color image. This led to an extreme gray that holds higher contrast and very little saturation. This look gained popularity in the 90s and was used in many iconic films that gave these films an edgy and raw look.
Today, we can produce video content in pretty much seconds. Just look at TikTok for an example. It's a free app with a built-in video editor right on your phone. The same applies to any video editing platform today, like Adobe Premiere, Final Cut, Avid, which are forms of non-linear editing software. It takes digital files, you splice them, you cut them, you move them all around the timeline because it's non-linear. You can add effects, and if you make a mistake, we can just simply undo it. We don't have to worry about cutting the wrong piece of an actual film strip. So, non-linear editing is non-destructive. So, you guessed it, linear editing is for physical film. Let's take a brief look back at the transition from linear to non-linear editing. Film was physically cut. If you've ever heard the saying on the cutting room floor, it's because film was spliced, taped together, and the pieces that didn't make it into the film were actually left on the cutting room floor. Computers for editing were introduced in the 1970s, which required disk drives the size of washing machines. It's crazy. So because of this, it was very hard for the average everyday person or indie filmmaker to actually have this luxury. It wasn't until the late 80s that software like Avid and Adobe Premiere was created to edit video. From the late 2000s to now, digital cameras and digital editing is what dominates the industry, and is ultimately why so many beginners can enter this profession or even just learn it as a hobby like we are right now.
The ship is gonna suck us down. Take a deep breath when I say.
The 90s were a very special time when it came to big names in Hollywood. It was a decade where many of the big named actors and directors we see today had their come up. But it was also a decade where many of the big names of previous decades were still very active. It was almost as though the 90s were the decade where there was a passing of the baton from older generations to newer generations. Some of the big names that were still very active during the 90s were directors like Steven Spielberg and James Cameron. And we saw the introduction of ones like Quentin Tarantino and Wes Anderson. We also saw a ton of big named actors and actresses, from ones that were already famous like Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Robin Williams, Julianne Moore, and Sigourney Weaver, to the ones that made their name in the 90s like Leonardo DiCaprio, Jim Carrey, Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Cameron Diaz, Kate Winslet, and Charlize Theron, to name a few. You could really tell that the 90s were a powerhouse of big name celebrities. The 90s were also a time where traditional celebrities were hitting their peak of popularity. This was still true into the 2000s, but these days there are so many quote-unquote new types of celebrities like all of the influencers that we see. It was the last decade where the hype and obsession about celebrities was very much present, but all of these celebrities were just a mystery behind closed doors, unless their personal lives were being smeared on the front page of newspapers. We didn't have social media yet, and there was a certain feel to the celebrities from that decade. This is much different than today, where celebrities tend to interact with their fans so much more, and even give a certain glimpse into their personal lives.
For my research, the genesis of 90s cool came from 5 primary influences. Number 1. The action craze of the 80s through early 90s. Action movies were king in the 80s and early 90s, with action stars like Arnold, Sylvester Stallone, and Bruce Willis rising to the top of Hollywood. 90s cool takes a lot of influence from films like Rambo, Terminator, and Die Hard. Number 2. Hong Kong cinema. Along with the rise of action in the West, you had plenty of awesome martial arts movies in the East that grew increasingly popular. The most prominent of these being Jackie Chan movies like Police Story and John Woo's shoot-'em-up movies that served as a huge inspiration for future action filmmakers. Number 3. The influence of anime. Although it was not yet mainstream, anime became a cult favorite and had a huge influence on Western filmmakers. Movies like Akira, Vampire Hunter D, and Ghost in the Shell are a huge influence on the genre. Number 4. Counterculture, fashion, and music. Dressing in all black and leather was always cool. But the film that really makes the black leather and sunglasses look take off is 1987's The Lost Boys. From there, many people in underground circles started adopting this style, and it grew increasingly popular in the mainstream. At the same time, dark and moody music became the norm and started being featured in film soundtracks. Number 5. The rise of technology and futurism. In the 90s, technology was growing at a faster pace than ever before, and people were speculating how the internet would change the future. Consequently, many film plots started addressing how technology such as AI and virtual reality would change life as we knew it. In 1994, these 5 influences combined to bring us what I believe is the first true 90s cool movie, The Crow. From there, the genre reached its absolute peak in 1999 with The Matrix. And from 1999 to 2005, everything was trying to be The Matrix. 90s cool reached its death spiral from 2005 to 2009 with a number of terrible movies that felt dated a week after release. In the post-90s cool era, the genre still lives on in a number of ways. John Wick, for example, is a great and refined throwback to the genre that stars the king of 90s cool, Keanu Reeves.